Hey everyone, it's Cassimus Lego, and I'm back for one last minifigure video in 2022, and I'm very excited to say that this is the third and final installment in the Lord of the Rings project, and all 11 of these figures are from The Return of the King. This series has been some of the most fun I've had working on any project. I'm so incredibly pleased to have made it all the way to the end, celebrating the epic conclusion to one of my favorite film trilogies ever made, and one of the greatest stories ever told. It was 3 years ago that I conceptualized this series, and now here we are at the finish line, and for this grand finale, I have a brand new Aragorn, son of Arathorn and heir to the throne of Gondor, an updated Gandalf the White, this time having a really soft fabric overcape, brand new to the series, King Theoden of Rohan, Ringbearer Frodo Baggins and his faithful kin Samwise Gamgee, Peregrine Took and Gondor armor, King Denethor II, the Mouth of Sauron, Lord of the Nazgul, the Witch King of Angmar, Lady Eowyn disguised as Durnhelm, and finally Meriadoc Brandybuck as a Rohirrim squire. That was very descriptive, I realize, but this is the final installment, and so I just had to go all out even in this intro. All 11 of these figures were made over the course of 2 months. Quite a challenge, especially considering some of the more detailed figures in this set, but still nothing too insane. I did cut some corners here and there, but I've got explanations that I'll get into in time. I'm very excited to show you these guys, and I hope that you enjoy all of the work I put into these figures. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get a close-up look at each and every one of these custom LEGO minifigures. Starting off with this showcase is the final version of Aragorn, son of Arathorn, heir to Isildur and to the throne of Gondor. A very different figure compared to the previous two Aragorn figures that I've made, because this one isn't wearing a variation of the Dunedain Ranger outfit, but instead the royal battle armor complete with the Tree of Gondor painted in silver in the center of the robes, and actually the robes are fabric and they are glued to the front and back of the torso. I knew I was going to be making a fabric waistcoat, and so I wanted to keep that consistency with the texturing of the robes, and I think it looks really great here. I couldn't imagine painting that design on the base torso after doing this. I especially love how the fabric just barely goes over the shoulders, which is accurate to the costume in the film, and you can see some minor details painted underneath, picking out the tunic and the chest with even a few strands of hair. But like I said, the Tree of Gondor was all painted, which was definitely not easy. You can imagine my frustration as I tried to keep both sides as symmetrical as possible, and while you can see some errors here and there, I think when you consider the entire detail as a whole, you really don't notice them as much. I guess you can call that the power of an intricately painted design. Above that, I painted the correct number of star-like symbols too. Those are challenging, especially when you consider the spacing and thickness. I also really like the other details that are 3D sculpted, such as these two oval-like shapes that keep the cape together, and on the figure, it's kind of an illusion. I say that because one of the pieces is attached to the fabric cape, and the other is attached to the torso. It's a bit strange, it's just the way the glue settled in place, but in actuality, it has no bearing on the rest of the figure, and when you put the head back on, you don't even get a glimpse of its inconsistency, so it's fine. The belts are 3D E-tape, and the piece to the left overlaps the main belt, and there's this little bit of sculpting representing the buckle. The sculpting here looks really nice, I have to say, because it starts on the back side of the E-tape and goes over the front and then connects with itself on the back again. It's completely accurate to how all these sculpted buckles should be, and if my memory serves me right, I believe just Aragorn has this feature. There's also some more painted details like the two belt loops on the left, and whatever this thing is here, kinda looks like a left-handed banjo. I imagine there won't be any other time to show the back, so we can do it here now. And as you can see, there's basically nothing here, just the continuation of the fabric robes and the belt made again in E-tape. The legs are mostly obstructed by the custom removable fabric waistcoat, but you can see some of the painted boot details in all of their metallic and gold glory. I'm quite pleased with the outcome of the boots. They're some of the most consistent looking parts of the entire figure. Here's the rest of the calf armor now that I've removed the waistcoat. I cut and shaped each piece from dry sculpted Procreate and painted a suggestion of the Gondor armor designs. It's simplistic, but I think it works here. Now, I've made a lot of fabric waistcoats over the years, but this one I have for Aragorn may be the cleanest one I've made yet. Usually my cutting on the sides is a little bit off, but here that's not the case. Look how uniform the fabric is on the sides of the figure. Notice how it doesn't bulge out in odd directions. It's very smooth, and obviously I love it. It's painted in Admiral Blue with the red lining, and I even painted the gold lining specifically seen on the front. The fabric silver underneath represents the chainmail armor, and I had to attach the fabric in a unique way. Typically, fabric builds up the more layers you attach, and if you have too many, they simply can't go on minifigures anymore. I started doing this method with my Two Towers figures actually. The fabric here appears to be fully underneath the blue robes, but in reality, it's no more than a thin strand glued to the sides of the fabric. It's very seamless, and it looks phenomenal in my opinion. On Aragorn's left, I have his sheath, which is dry sculpted and painted. Maybe one day I could start making ones that are actually functional. That would be sweet. The arms were nothing too difficult either, but thankfully I already had a little head start on the chainmail sleeves. I forgot that I sculpted those details for Aragorn last year, for the Two Towers actually. I was originally going to make Aragorn as he appears in the Battle of Helm's Deep, with the chainmail armor exposed, but I decided to make his coat instead, and that allowed me to use these arms for this figure. We'll start at the shoulder armor, since they're by far way more complex than some of the other arms I've done. Each layer on the shoulder armor was sculpted in different sculpting sessions separated by multiple hours. And this took a long time considering some of the pieces had even more details in the center that had to be done first before I went on to the next layer. But I took my time and eventually got to painting them, coating them first in gunmetal gray and then lining them with gold. The gauntlets are painted with the forearm pieces made from E-tape covering the custom red glove top pieces, just like the last version. I did my best to paint both pieces of armor with whatever details I thought looked the most accurate. I wouldn't say these were more complex than the painted designs on Boromir's gauntlets, but these were quite annoying to paint in their own right. Thankfully, I still think they came out really clean and accurate looking. The head is the standard Viggo Mortensen head print from the original LEGO Lord of the Rings line from 2012. I didn't do that much to it, it's already a near perfect likeness, but I just repainted the facial hair and eyebrows to better match the color of the painted hair. I attempted to do some facial hair details to the stubble, but there wasn't much I could do without removing part of the print, and I did not want to do that. These heads are pricey enough already, and I wasn't comfortable doing anything that might damage the head, so I left it as is. But whatever I did to the front expression, I had to match on the back alternate aggressive expression as well. The hair on this guy is unique and features some sculpting. This time, I did not want to carry over the old man Luke hairpiece again. That hairpiece was never that accurate to begin with, and for this final Aragorn custom minifigure, I wanted to do him justice. So I took some inspiration from my friend the Lego Painter on Instagram. You might remember I mentioned him a lot during my Two Towers showcase. He made that absolutely incredible Aragorn minifigure, and I really liked the hair he did for him where he just modified a female minifigure hairpiece. And I decided to do the same. So I cut down the front of the hair and sanded down the sides like crazy before I sculpted the back sides in and added the groove lines. I also sculpted these two random hair strands on the front and painted the entire thing in burnt umber, and if you ask me, this really completes the look of Viggo Mortensen in the trilogy. It has that custom look while still appearing like it's an everyday Lego mold. I wish I had done this sooner, but I suppose it's better to have done it now than never attempting it at all. And finally, we can talk about the sword and drill. I've been saving this portion until the end because actually these swords in this project are very unique. Instead of painting official LEGO swords like I've done in the past, I wanted to do something special for these final Lord of the Rings minifigures, something I thought was well deserved in their favor. These swords are actually 3D printed. Every 3D printed sword in this video was designed by a maker known as Miniman. The files are available on the website CG Trader, and if you're interested, you can check them out for yourself by following the link in the description. I had gotten most of these files, and I went down to my university's makerspace where some of my friends and I had a great afternoon of 3D printing. I've used casts and other 3D printed pieces from makers like Nate Minifigs before, but this was the first time I was printing them for myself, and it was a ton of fun. I did sand away the blades to remove the filament markings as best as I could, but even then, these swords look awesome on the minifigures. I'm incredibly happy with these accessories, and I can't wait for you to see the rest of them in this video. Anyway, that was everything I wanted to mention on my final custom Aragorn minifigure. A bit exhaustive, I know, but you gotta understand, this video is the last installment in the series, a project that means the world to me as a LEGO customizer, and so I wanted to be as thorough as I possibly can. This Aragorn figure is by far the best version of the character I've made, and this 3D printed Anduril and sculpted hair make all the difference to me, and so that was Viggo Mortensen's Aragorn as a custom LEGO minifigure. Let's move on. Next up is Gandalf the White, and for this final version of Ian McKellen's character, I wanted to make him look much better than the Two Towers version. So as you can see, most of the figure is the same. I've carried over the modified beard and hair combo piece, the painted torso, and even the belts are the exact same 3D E-tape pieces that I carefully removed from the old fabric waistcoat and glued onto this new sheet of fabric. The additions look really nice here. I mentioned during my return to the Jedi figures that I was considering remaking my Gandalf the White with these cleaner sheets of white fabric, and that's exactly what I've done here. Whereas before I made a standard fabric cape using Lego stencil, here I've made a custom overcape, which is by far way more accurate in capturing Gandalf's white robes. I've even taken it a step further by ensuring that the edges of the fabric don't fray by coating them in a fabric glue, and it's done the trick just fine. I can freely move the arms and even remove this entire cape without worrying about ruining this fabric. There's no painted details on it, however, it's just the white fabric, and if you ask me, I think it looks perfect. These legs are also brand new, and I painted some boots if you can see them underneath there. Of course, I did extend Gandalf's legs by one plate, just like I did with the original version. I just like seeing this minifigure stand taller than the other figures. I believe it fits Gandalf's character very well. For the fabric robes on the legs, I decided to give Gandalf a new technique yet again. I did attempt making a fabric waistcoat with that new fabric, but it wasn't coming out the way I wanted. It was still way too full as it wrapped around the legs, and what was worse was that the tension from it was ripping the fabric, even with the E-tape supports on the inside. And as I was working on it, a thought occurred to me. What if I just glued a sheet of fabric to the front and sides of the hip piece, but it doesn't actually go all the way around? This way, I could keep the fabric going in the right directions that I wanted, and I wouldn't have those issues I was having while trying to keep it clean. And here on the figure, I think it looks really great, and not to mention, seamless. I love how it kind of spreads out naturally, and when you look at the sides with the overcape, you can't even tell that the fabric doesn't continue to the back. Of course, the downside here is that this fabric waist piece is not removable. It is glued in place and is not going anywhere. But for me, it's a fair trade-off since there's hardly any details on the legs to begin with. Before we move on, here you can see I did the same overlapping fabric technique that I did on Aragorn. Gandalf has two accessories, and we'll start with his white wizard staff. The original staff was alright for the time, but for the remake, I wanted to make something even better, and once again, Minimates comes to the rescue. I wasn't even aware that Lord of the Rings Minimates figures existed, but apparently they did way back in the day, and one of those figures in the lineup was Gandalf the White with this staff. I don't get the opportunity often, but I like to use Minimates parts because they are relatively in scale to LEGO minifigures, and they make for great alternatives to accessories that otherwise would be challenging to make. And Gandalf's staff here was no exception. I bought the figure online for a great price, still sealed I might add. I guess they just aren't that much in demand, but I wanted this staff to be as new as possible. And even here, you can see that the plastic is slightly bent. That's completely natural. I did nothing to cause it to look like that. It came straight from the box this way. But it doesn't bother me too much. I did slightly modify the bottom so it'll be a little bit smaller and fit better in the hand, and I painted it all in white and sealed everything over to keep it clean. It just looks so much better than the last staff that I made, even with the slight deformity. The other accessory is the sword of the White Wizard, Glamdring. Like Anduril, this is also a 3D printed sword designed by Miniman. Painted all up, of course, and it feels great to have both of these essential accessories for this final Gandalf the White custom. And with that said, that's all I have for this figure. Didn't spend too much time on the figure, but these new additions really make this figure one of the best in the entire project. Here you're looking at the final Frodo Baggins minifigure that you'll see from me, depicting his weary look upon entering Cirith Ungol, and eventually to the cracks of Doom itself. And this for me is such a milestone. As I mentioned earlier, I've been thinking about making these specific versions of these iconic characters for nearly 4 years, and it feels so great to finally embark on making them in LEGO, and I'm just so pleased with the outcome of these next two minifigures specifically. So for Frodo, the main challenge here was representing the weary and dirty appearance without overdoing it with the weathering, and the same thing applies to Sam. And some of you might know, I've never liked the process of weathering my figures. There's such a fine balance between just the right amount of dirt and grime, and then painting too much and just ruining the figure flat out. But I knew that Frodo and Sam wouldn't be complete without depicting the physical appearance one would take by trudging through Mordor on the minifigures. So I went about a little bit of dry brushing to the front and back sides of the torso, the sleeves on the arms, and the feet with a light brown. And thankfully, I'm satisfied with the details on both of them. I did have to tone back some of the dirt here and there, but overall, they look good enough for me. In essence, Frodo's appearance doesn't change much throughout the trilogy. He just loses his coat and vest, and so I thought this was going to make the figure look pretty under-detailed, and so to make up for it, I just beefed up the details that were already there, just to basically make the ultimate Frodo Baggins minifigure as he appears in The Return of the King. I used highly detailed figures such as the Prime 1 Studio statue as a reference, and I based a majority of the details on that. Take these long Hobbit pant suspenders for instance. The base is much higher on the torso, and I painted all 4 buttons and even the little line that depicts where the front of the pants would be connected. That was tricky, painting a straight line up a curved surface of the short legs. The short legs are perfect, and I of course painted the Hobbit hair on top of the toes, just a random design I painted on every Hobbit minifigure I've made from the first one I did in 2020. The belts are E-tape, and to differentiate them from the brown pants, I outlined the edges in chestnut. The loop on the left of the figure is sculpted, and I also dry sculpted his little sheath and added minor details to that. Since there was going to be no vest to hide the suspender straps, I wanted those to be as detailed as possible. Instead of using E-tape like I've done in the past, I went with fabric painted in light brown since to me that looked way more accurate according to the reference images I was using. I outlined them also in that chestnut color, and I really like how they contrast with the torso, and speaking of which, the painting came out really awesome too. I went with the same light brown color to paint the shirt and wrinkles. The buttons here look really nice. I'm happy with how clean they came out, not only on the torso, but also these buttons on the fabric suspenders. Those were probably some of my favorite details. A unique feature I wanted to represent on this version of Frodo specifically are the scars on the neck left by the weight of the One Ring. Another nice detail. There isn't much to see on the arms, but I thought it would be fun to sculpt the sleeves from Frodo's tunic. It wasn't necessarily easy to pick out, but I think it adds a lot to the figure. Frodo's elven cloak is custom made of course, and actually the exact same way I made it for the Two Towers version, even down to the way I made the hood drape over the back. This time painted in pavement instead of dark gray, and if you remove it, we can look at the back of the torso, which is much of the same as we saw on the front, more of the 3D belt outline in chestnut, few wrinkles, and the fabric suspenders. For the head, I went with the standard LEGO Frodo head from 2012. This is already a very great resemblance to Elijah Wood, but to make it all that much better, I went ahead and weathered the front of the head here and painted the various scars he gets by the end of the film. The alternate expression with the crazy eyes is pretty appropriate here too. But if I'd rather have a clean face for Frodo, I have plenty of these heads lying around, so that's an option as well. Something else that I knew would make this head better though was brightening the white pupils in the eyes. I don't know why, but it seems a large majority of Frodo heads have tiny printed pupils, so I'm glad I fixed it here. What's also standard is the original Hobbit hairpiece in LEGO's dark base brown. For Frodo, I've given him 2 accessories, and we can start with Sting, which is the very same sword accessory I made for the Two Towers Frodo minifigure, but I decided to clean up the design of the blade a little bit, and I think it's perfectly fine. However, I will say that a blue glow-in-the-dark Sting was attempted, but I decided to scrap it because it wasn't that bright even when I left it absorbing in direct sunlight. A good try for sure, but it wasn't that important to finish. The standard Sting is perfect enough. And now, Frodo finally has the ring itself on a chain that can be arranged in a few ways, which makes it super cool. As you can see, I found a chain small enough to attach it around the LEGO element, and I can have the minifigure hold it up just as Frodo does in the Cracks of Doom. For me, this is the preferred way to display the minifigure, but something else I did which was also really cool was make the chain long enough so it can be hung directly from his neck, and I've wanted to do this for so long, and I figured this was my last chance to make one work, and I'm so glad it does. It's not perfect by any means, you can see how it doesn't lay flush with the torso, but overall, it can still hang by the neck and still looks great, and for me, it came out wonderfully. I'll end this segment with a recreation of the climax of the film. This is awesome to create as a fully custom LEGO minifigure. You can see that I switched out the hand for an alternate hand that has a cut right through the middle of it with all of the blood and gross stuff depicted in reds and dark browns. This is the finger that Gollum bites off with the one ring on it, and I just wanted to make this accessory to complete this look, and I'm very happy that I managed to pull this thing off. It's very simple, but it looks great. Elijah Wood's Frodo Baggins is one of my favorite characters in film, and so making these 3 distinct versions has been so much fun, and I hope you like them. So that's it for Frodo Baggins the Ring Bearer, and we'll move on to by far my favorite character from The Lord of the Rings. And that, of course, being Samwise Gamgee. I think he's a lot of people's favorites, thanks to the lovable performance of Sean Astin throughout the trilogy, and this final custom minifigure of the character shares many similarities to Frodo, such as the painted tunic design, the suspenders, and those fabric straps. But he does have his differences, so I don't expect this segment to be very long. To start, the painted torso is very similar to Frodo's, painted with antique white to get that cream colored shirt, but I stayed consistent with the design that I've done for each of the previous Sam minifigures. The suspender straps are a little bit different as well. They're still light brown fabric outlined in a chestnut color, but you can see that they don't reach the pants like on Frodo. They just end slightly above, and then the rest of the strap details were painted. As far as I can tell, that's completely accurate to how Sam appears in the film. I'd say that's what I'm most pleased about with the figure. He and Frodo share many of the same details, but they still came out just different enough to be unique in their own regard. The weathering on the figure was just as annoying to do as it was on Frodo, and actually I decided to give Sam some sculpting on the arms too, and I did that just to make sure the sleeves looked poofier. The hobbit hair on the top of the toes appear here as well. The belt on the torso is made from E-tape and has a painted buckle unlike Frodo, but he carries over the exact same dry sculpted 3D sheath for his hobbit sword. You can probably notice that there are some details missing, notably the backpack straps and his side bag, and I'll say that I did not forget to include those. While working on the figure, I experimented with sculpting the straps from the backpack on the inside of this fabric cape, and even though I was able to glue them with no problem, I couldn't get them to be flush against the front of the torso, and I knew that if I made some kind of 3D removable bag accessory, it was just going to bulk up the figure way more than I wanted it to. So for the sake of preserving Sam's appearance during the climax of the film, I decided to not include those details and just made a custom fabric cape for him, and on the back is my final attempt to make Sam's travel backpack one final time. And this version is almost completely sculpted aside from a few modified Lego studs and antennas that I slapped on there. Like last year, this was a lot of fun to make. I had complete freedom to use whatever pieces I wanted to represent the various frying pans, bowls, pouches, and sausage strands. Even with the freedom that I gave myself, I still tried to keep the backpack as accurate as possible. Some new additions include this rectangular shape that hangs down from the back, and the blanket, this time sculpted rather than cutting off the piece from an official Lego backpack accessory and throwing it on like I did for the Two Towers Sam. I like this much more since you can actually see the coiling going on in the insides. This is definitely the best Sam backpack that I've made in this entire series, and it was very interesting seeing how I went about making basically the exact same accessory in different ways in each of these projects. Removing the cape reveals the back of the torso, which is once again, like Frodo, much of the same, with more painted wrinkles, fabric suspender straps, and the continuation of the belt. The Samwise Gamgee head from the original 2012 line also carries over, and I made sure to repaint the eyebrows on both expressions in a dark brown to match the look of Sean Astin in the film. Pretty generic print, but I love it. It works really well for the character. For the hair, I've of course used the Lego Hobbit hairpiece from 2012, and I'm glad to be using Lego's base color of medium nougat. In the past, I've painted the hair in a somewhat muted light brown. It was Apple Barrel's Territorial Beige, if you're curious, which sometimes dries in a dull, desaturated tone, which was fine to experiment with at the time, but Sam's hair is much brighter in color, even with all of the filthy particles of Mordor lingering near his hair, so I think this is a positive change. I will be honest though, it took some convincing from a few friends for me to make the switch, but in the end, it's a far more accurate look for Samwise Gamgee. As far as accessories go, I've given Sam two very important ones. The sword is nothing too fancy, just the same short Lego sword that I've been using. Started with the base in a pearl dark gray color and painted the blade in silver and clear coated it. But what I'm really excited to show you is the Phial of Galadriel containing the Light of Arendelle. It follows what LEGO originally intended from the 2012 Sheilog attack set, and I just expanded it. I used the same translucent LEGO gem element flipped upside down, and I extended the top by gluing a cut piece from a translucent rod to the end. And that's where I painted the suggestions of the wrappings, some of the most difficult lines to paint on the entire project. Painting thin, straight lines onto ABS LEGO plastic, that being transparent as well, was not easy, my friends, so I'm very pleased to say that this came out pretty smoothly. This thing is very delicate though. You can see how the LEGO hand connects with both pieces towards the middle, so to make sure that this is never going to break off, I just ended up gluing these two pieces directly into the hand itself, so you can bet these are never coming off. If I wish to give Sam a normal pair of light nougat hands, I can easily just remove the entire hand with the file as one piece, and it came out wonderfully. All in all, this final Samwise Gamgee minifigure stays very faithful to design aspects of Frodo, much like his character in the original novels and films, so I really couldn't ask for a better concluding experience of making my favorite character in The Lord of the Rings. This version is by far the best. Next up, a figure that had a long time coming in my collection. Here is Lord Theoden, portrayed by Bernard Hill, the King of Rohan during the Third Age of Middle-earth, and what a figure he is. He is definitely the most detailed minifigure out of this entire set, and I'm so happy I was finally able to make him in LEGO. Originally, I wanted to make him last year for the Two Towers project, but I ultimately went with Éomer instead because I thought that made a little bit more sense at the time. So essentially, that makes this King Theoden minifigure the Éomer of this project. He took up so much of my time. I believe I spent the entire week of my Thanksgiving break just to finish him. He's got all of this sculpting and gold detailing, and the helmet on top of that was crazy to do. It was all just so overwhelming, but I'll go through this segment pretty slowly, so hopefully you can keep up with me. We'll start with some of the easiest pieces to get out of the way, the accessories. I've given Theoden both his sword and shield, which were both modified from standard LEGO elements. The sword hero rim was pretty simple. I didn't use a 3D piece like I did for Aragorn, and just used the base of LEGO's more recent sword accessory found in the castle sets since 2020. And I sanded down the guard to try and shape it to match the heart-shaped guard of the sword, and painted it in gold, and you can even see a bit of silver in the center there, depicting the negative space and the blade. I cut the bottom off of the hilt and glued a piece from a LEGO bar element in its place, and I think that came out very well. Painted the blade up in silver, and then coated it in sealant to give it a clean, shiny look, and if you ask me, I really like the variety of swords I've made for each figure, and you'll get the chance to see them all later on. For the shield, I took a base LEGO shield with the edge line, and I removed the center stud to sculpt the round center piece, and then I painted the entire design that you see. That was pretty challenging, but I'm very happy with it, and I love that I was able to pack in so many details, even into something pretty small like this. So with those two accessories taken care of, we can look at the rest of the king, and where do we start? I think it would be easiest to start at the bottom and work our way up. So for the legs, I started with a base pair of dark brown LEGO legs, even though I later found out that it made more sense for them to be in dark red, so I repainted them after the fact. With the waistcoat removed, I can give you a good look at the knee armor and the other details around them. The armor plates were dry sculpted and painted to match each other. The straps wrap around all sides of the legs, and the boots were painted with many copper highlights. This waistcoat continues the trend of clean looking fabric waistcoats I've done, but with not too many painted details. I love how the silver painted fabric just looks like chainmail here, so that's nice for me, but I kept it pretty simplistic. But you can see that there is some green fabric peeking out underneath it, and as for these two armor pieces, they're dry sculpted and painted really smoothly. Let's move up to the torso, which is where a fair amount of the overall detailing went into. I did my best to make this chest armor as accurate as possible, but you can probably see this isn't an exact copy of every section of gold detailing on the armor from the film. There's just too much to squeeze onto this tiny minifigure torso, so I let myself paint whatever I could. That said, I still think this came out to be not only very recognizable, but also very clean in its own right. All of these patterns and designs are painted across two sculpted chest armor pieces to add that bulkiness required for the protection of the king, and I love how it looks, especially the transition from the stomach to the chest plate. It looks seamless. The belt running along the front of the torso and the overlapping knots are also sculpted, and the piece that drapes over the fabric waistcoat is E-tape. There's some minimal painted details including these gold latches and buckles, but what I think stands out the most is the chain detail over here on the left side of the figure, which is just like Éomer and how I used a chain on his shoulder belt. The back of the torso was painted too, and finding reference for this design was not easy, but I eventually found some images from the backs of display figures, so I at least had something to go off of. I'm still pretty happy with it. Theoden's shoulder armor is almost the exact same armor I did for Éomer. Each piece is 3D sculpted, and the shoulders themselves have a little bit of unique detail to represent the natural wear. These thin rectangles on the shoulders were by no means fun to do, but I still liked them, and the little buttons on the corners of all 4 pieces of the armor look great. The gauntlets are made from E-tape, and I extended them by painting the continuation of the detail on these custom LEGO glove tops. For as similar as this figure is to Éomer, the patterns on the gauntlets are actually not the same, but close enough to still be annoying to paint. And then of course Theoden has some basic LEGO dark brown gloves. That just leaves us to talk about the helmet, which was a super intimidating task. Most of the details on replicas and such aren't even things you can just easily paint, so like the torso, I just painted whatever was necessary on the helmet to keep it looking as accurate as possible while ensuring that the details could stand by on their own and look awesome. I started with an original LEGO Rohirrim soldier helmet and just went from there basically. I managed to get the helmet done, but this was probably some of the most detailed work I've done on any figure of this year. Each side was a whole day of on and off work, and I remember being so relieved when they were finally all done. And looking at it on the camera now, it looks really awesome. So I'm glad it paid off. The leather pieces here on the back also look really cool. You can see the stitching details that I painted. It's just a curved painted chestnut line that I broke off here and there. These kinds of details are pretty easy to paint, but in my opinion, they add so much realism to leather looking material pieces. I haven't used that method as much as I would like, so I'm happy to have included it here. The head inside the helmet is the original head print depicting the likeness of Bernard Hill from the 2012 LEGO Lord of the Rings line, but I changed up a few things. First, I did the standard stuff to both expressions, such as repainting the eyebrow colors to be correct and adding more white to brighten the pupils, but I also sculpted some of a 3D beard to both sides of the head. I didn't want it to be too full, just a little bit to give it that 3D look, but also ensure that the helmet could still be removed without damaging it in any way. I painted it in khaki and dry brushed some lighter colors to make it look more natural. I've also chosen to give the king the Alistair Moody hairpiece in base tan to depict his curly blonde hair. You know me, I probably abuse this hairpiece, but for Theoden's case, I think it looks really great here. For King Theoden, it goes without saying how time consuming it was to make this minifigure, so I hope that you've enjoyed this segment and all of the work I put into just him alone. I'm very pleased with the outcome of the figure. He's easily one of the best of not only this showcase, but also the entire year. And that's about it for the King of Rohan, Lord Theoden. Here we have my second figure of Miranda Otto's Éowyn, this time as she assumes the alias of Durmhelm to disguise herself in the Rohirrim army. And this was the version of the figure that I was excited to make. Last year's Éowyn is as standard as any minifigure gets, but this time she's got sculpted armor, gauntlets, and 2 fabric elements, not to mention the removable helmet that was almost entirely modified from a standard LEGO Rohan soldier helmet, including the faceplate and the sculpted hair in the back. Like her uncle, there's a lot to go over on this figure, and we'll start with her sword and shield, both modified from standard LEGO minifigure elements. The sword construction process was the same as Theoden's, although I kept the guard to be the original shape, and the blade is painted in silver and sealed over. The shield is a little bit different than Theoden's though. It started out as a standard LEGO shield element with a rounded top, and I just sculpted onto it and made those indent lines with my X-Acto knife. I tried to give them all equal spacing, but it was a little bit tricky. I painted the horse designs and then sealed everything over as well. These two make for great accessories. Anytime I have the opportunity to make a complete figures arsenal, I do my best to hop on that. I still remember that I didn't make a shield for Boromir, for instance, so I'd like to correct that any way I can going forward. So for the rest of this new Éowyn figure, I think a common theme that you'll see on not only this minifigure, but also the majority of the figures in this video is that reference is not that easy to find. Who knew a film from the early 2000s doesn't always give a clear head-to-toe look at its characters and costumes like we get today. So a lot of what I'm basing these designs on comes from action figures of the characters, both in the small scale and the massive premium statue figures. Éowyn here is no exception, but despite my difficulty finding reference, I still think she came out awesome. We'll first begin down at the legs, which have a sweet little detail I'd love to point out. The boot details here are actually the same design that I painted on Faramir. Of course, at the end of the story, when peace returns to the land, Faramir and Éowyn get married, and I thought it would be a sweet little detail if I shared a specific detail between just these two figures, even something as minuscule like the way that I painted the boots. The rest of the legs are pretty simple. Base legs were painted in chestnut, and she has a custom fabric waistcoat painted in English green ivy. Overlaid is a smaller sheet of fabric painted in silver. I don't really know what to call these two armor pieces on the waist piece, but I dry sculpted those, painted them accordingly, and glued them directly onto the fabric. On the torso, I started with a sculpted chest plate with those two strap-like things, and the belt, all sculpted of course. I didn't want all of those details to mesh, so I made sure to add those lighter brown highlights to any of the overlapping pieces, just so that everything is easily seen. Something I wish you could see a bit better though are the two Rohirrim horses on the torso. I painted both of those in dark red and added all kinds of tiny details, but unfortunately I kind of messed up here because these straps cover up most of them. What isn't a mistake though is the size of the torso. This is a female minifigure, and yet I decided not to represent the feminine physique by sanding and shaping the edges of the torso. Simply because I imagine all of this armor would hide it in reality. I mean, that's the whole point of Éowyn's disguise, so I decided to just leave it off. And to me, it really makes no difference in the end. Some more 3D pieces include the shoulder belt straps. Those are fabric as well, and underneath all of this is a base layer of chainmail, and you can see it continue onto the arms, where the shoulders are sculpted and textured just like I did on Aragorn's arms. Actually, I got the diamond-shaped texture by rolling my X-Acto knife's outer shell onto the surface of my sculpt and basically stamped it. That's an idea I got from Brickophilia on Instagram, by the way. Éowyn's gauntlets are pretty simple, just completely made from E-tape with 3 different pieces painted in different colors representing the bands. Before we get any further, I'd like to discuss this helmet, which I stated was modified from an original Rohirrim soldier helmet. That was very much the case. I spent so much time sanding off the horse at the top of the helmet and just rounding off the surface to get it as smooth as possible. But the biggest challenge for the figure was making the plate to hide the face underneath. Getting that shape was not easy. I tried sculpting it first, but it was pretty clear early on that one wasn't going to work. It was way too soft and delicate to sculpt for me, so instead I attempted to cut the shape from a piece of dry sculpt. What you're looking at now is the 3rd attempt, and thankfully I think this came out pretty well. There was a crack in the process of making it, which was a heart attack for me, but I've done my best to hide it with sanding and glue, so hopefully you can't even notice it. Shape-wise, it's more than adequate, I would say. I think the eye holes look correct, but it's missing the dip on the nose. I'll tell you what though, gluing this to the inside of the helmet piece was a real test of patience, but I'm so glad it worked out in the end. It goes without saying everything on this helmet was painted. I like the varying colors in gunmetal, dark brown, copper, and of course gold. On the back I have another sheet of silver fabric, which is such a perfect design because it hides the transition from the helmet to the sculpted hair. Yeah, underneath that thing is ugly, I can tell you that. You can already see it, but I do have another custom painted Otto likeness. That was a little Germa reference in case anyone's curious, but this time it's depicting an aggressive facial expression. Even though the mouth doesn't really line up with the opening on the helmet, I think I should consider myself lucky that at least you can see the eyes through the helmet, because this kind of looks like a puppet. You don't even see her mouth, which I think is kind of funny. I also have this alternate hairpiece to give to her, which I think works really well for her appearance in The Return of the King. So that's all I have to say for this new Éowyn custom. I'd say it came out very well. Little Sword Thane Meriadoc Brandybuck was a lot of fun to revisit, he and his partner Pippin. This is the second version of the character I've made in LEGO, and of course I had to make him in his Rohirrim armor. So first things first, I want to talk about Merry's helmet. In the film, even he has a different helmet from each of the other Rohirrim, so I used a completely different base to start with. Instead of the standard LEGO Rohan soldier helmet, I actually went with a LEGO Star Wars Imperial pilot helmet because I like the shape of the helmet itself, specifically speaking about the sides here. I did heavily modify this thing though, so you can see that I somewhat carved into the corners there. That's accurate to Mary's helmet, and I've also sculpted the top parts there that run all the way to the back, and here is where you can see where I spend a majority of my time on the helmet. I had to somehow make the pieces of leather seen on both the helmets of Éomer and Theoden. See, the backs of these LEGO Imperial helmets are the same continuous plastic of that from the sides, so I basically had to cut into that and sculpt these two things and mesh the sculpt with the openings that I made. That was an obstacle, but I think it looks really good and even better once I painted the leather stitching. Another detail I really like is the chin strap, which is made from fabric, and I painted the buckles on either side. Taking off the helmet reveals the custom Dominic Monaghan face that I painted, and actually I painted two expressions for him. Here's the aggressive facial expression that I based off of the official head, and the other is slightly more neutral, but it still shows that Brandybuck attitude. Personally, I prefer the yelling expression, and actually the custom face print that I painted way back in the Fellowship Mary works really great here too. I also have a Hobbit hairpiece for Mary as well. Like Sam, it's in a medium nougat, perfect for a singing, smoking, and partying hobbit. Let's look at the torso, which was, in concept, very similar to his Lord Theoden in the sense that I sculpted the chest armor onto the base torso. Even the parallel lines are a detail the two have in common. Mary's kind of got an overalls thing going on here with all these sculpted chest plates, and as far as details go, that's basically it. In the references I was using, there were all kinds of swirling line details, but honestly, I was not up for that, so I went as simple as possible, only focusing on the most noticeable armor lines. I do have some buttons painted on towards the bottom of the torso that came out pretty nicely, however. Making up for the simplistic aesthetic are these large torso belts made from E-tape with different levels of thickness. I outlined all of the edges in chestnut, and there's even a small gold buckle near the center of the thinnest strap. I also have another 3D piece in the form of a dry sculpted sheath with just the bare minimum of details. The arms have some sculpting too, just near the top making out the baggy sleeves of the tunic though. I think the gauntlets here break up the dullness of the arms. I painted some details around them, nothing crazy, but these painted straps extend all the way around the arms, which is cool. I love when I'm able to paint details that smoothly, and the gold buckles are just fantastic. Legs? Nah, nothing too special as well. Mary's got some more hobbit hair on the top of his toes, and dark brown painted pants to go along with them. He also has a custom fabric waistcoat, of course, cut to the appropriate size for the short legs. Speaking of fabric, Mary has his own English green ivy cape made the same way as Frodo's. Mary has the usual two accessories, the sword and shield, and again both made from standard LEGO elements. Woo, nothing to celebrate here. I would go over the process of making these, but I think you got the idea by now. They are still a very important inclusion for me, they just make the finished figure look all the more complete when they've got something to hold in their hands. So that was Meriadoc Brandybuck, super fun to revisit him in this outfit, and I'm very happy I was able to represent these next two characters' growth in the trilogy as custom LEGO minifigures. So here we have Peregrine Took, and at this point in the story, maybe not so much of a fool anymore. Like his Hobbit partner Merry, this is also the second version of the character that I've made, and of course he's in his Gondor armor. Actually a pretty simplistic minifigure, the process was rather straightforward, and I'm very pleased to be using a custom Gondor soldier helmet from a bootleg minifigure. Don't bother asking me where I got it, because honestly, I don't remember anymore. Originally I was planning to sculpt one myself using a standard LEGO minifigure knight's helmet as a base. While I attempted it, it was pretty clear that using a bootleg piece instead would make for a much better figure, so that's what I ended up doing. And even still, I didn't do a whole lot of modifications, electing only to paint the entire thing in sterling silver and coat it in a protective layer of sealant. And gee, coming off of so many complexly detailed helmet pieces, this one was quite the breath of fresh air. While we're talking about the top portion of the minifigure, I'll also say that the head is the original Pippin Took print. Both expressions have a spot-on likeness to Billy Boyd, especially the frightened expression on the back. I've always loved that one. Like the rest of his kin, Pippin here uses the same LEGO Hobbit hairpiece, this time painted in nutmeg brown, reflecting the first version of Pippin that I made for the Fellowship project. The rest of the figure looks pretty good too. I decided to make his robe's fabric and 3D all around the torso, just like Aragorn, and I even have another one of these painted Tree of Gondor insignias, though this one is much smaller and less detailed in comparison. And you can chalk that up to me being lazy the day that I was working on this. Between you and me, I did not want to paint that tree a second time. Once is enough, and honestly, the two versions of this detail on the figures add a bit of uniqueness to the both of them, wouldn't you say? Anyway, the fabric continues to the short legs, where you can see another layer of silver fabric poking just underneath it. That also wraps all the way around the back, which is something that I will not show you because these belts just end abruptly and it's incredibly ugly. Just trust me, there's not a good reason to show you that. Speaking of which, these belts that are crisscrossed are made from E-tape. I painted the chestnut color ridgelines to all of the exposed areas, and I painted all of the minor gold details that you see. Some of which are covered by the additional 3D elements on the belt, like this sculpted pouch over here on the left side of the torso, and the sheath, cut from a sheet of dry sculpted Procreate. The belt buckle itself is also dry sculpted, I might add. It's missing some of the outer rim details, but I elected to just cut out and glue the buckle middle piece itself. Before we move on further, I of course might want to remind you that since we're talking about a Hobbit minifigure, Pippin of course does have the Hobbit hair details on the top of the toes. This is the 10th time that I've painted this bit of detail to a pair of short legs and will most likely be the last time. So I just want to say that it was very annoying to do, but it was fun seeing how much thinner I was able to get these random squiggly lines onto the toes year after year. Pippin's arms don't have too much to see, but the chainmail shoulder sleeves were made via the same method with the X-Acto knife that you've seen already on Aragorn and Éowyn. The gauntlets are E-tape and have their own set of symmetrical details. Based on the references I was using, I'd say I did a pretty good job keeping them accurate, but it's very hard to tell from those pictures. One final detail worth pointing out on Pippin is that he has another custom English green ivy fabric cape, and actually Merry has the exact same cape even down to the details like the wrinkles on the hood and the leaf of Lothlorien that are basically exact copies of each other. For Pippin, I actually went ahead and gave him a little painted sword, but the shield here came from the bootleg minifigure. It already has the tree detail there in the middle, and I thought any other detail around the sides or the back were unnecessary. It's good enough Pippin has something to hide behind to begin with. I feel like I kinda sped through this segment, but really Pippin was probably one of the easier figures of this project, and that was certainly thanks to this bootleg helmet. I think it's safe to say that if I were to have gone with the custom one I was trying to make, this figure would have turned out pretty differently, so hooray for off-brand compatible LEGO minifigures! But in all seriousness, this is a great little minifigure and surely a fantastic final little Hobbit figure. I've already gone through the Great Lord of Rohan, and now we can talk about the not-so-great Lord of Gondor throughout the Third Age, King Denethor II. And what you're looking at now is a figure that I wasn't sure was going to end up the way that it does now. And that's all because I didn't know if I was going to be able to make his big coat a 3D piece and still have the hairpiece work with that. And I must say, that was a challenge, but I'm very glad it turned out okay in the end. It is a fabric trench coat, but because of the way this figure is put together, it and the hairpiece will never be removed. They are essentially glued to each other. And I went with the 2017 LEGO Aquaman hairpiece here. I had a few options for representing the long hair, but this one was the only one that would fit, and even then it was a massive struggle getting the hairpiece in place. I'm thankful the base color here looks enough like the hair tone of the character in the film, because I did not want to have to paint it once I got the hairpiece on for the first time. LEGO never made an official John Noble face print, so I improvised, and actually I really like the head choice I decided to go with. This is Salazar Slytherin's head minus the beard piece, of course, and to me bears a very close likeness to Denethor. The hair drapes on the torso, but before I can talk about that, I want to finish up with the fabric robes. I painted the fabric black, and the big furry robe details that line every edge on the fabric was sculpted, and I used a pin to poke into the sculpt to get that texture. You can see that the fabric has a bit of a curved shape to the top in order to allow for more room for the hairpiece, and on the back there's a pretty significant gap of the sculpt to the back of the hairpiece. And this was another part that gave me so much trouble, and in the end I just sliced off the areas that were in the way and just didn't bother filling in any other gaps or anything because, well, I didn't care all that much by that point. The arms have some sculpting too to show the wide sleeves and the continuation of the fur lining. So for the robes underneath, I did a combination of a few different looks taken by the king in the film. I like the silver V-shaped cutout of the more formal robes, and also the chainmail-ish thin sheet of armor, so I mixed the two. This piece is made from fabric as well and extends onto the legs, and beneath that is another sheet of fabric in pavement. On the torso plate I have some detail in the form of these gunmetal parallel lines. The belt is 3D and pretty simple as far as belts go. It's made from E-tape in a few different layers. Nothing too extreme, I'm sure you can understand how I made it. The belt is 3D and is pretty simple as far as belts go. It's made from E-tape in a few different layers. Nothing too extreme. I'm sure you can use your noggin thinking caps to understand how I made it. In the department of accessories, I have a little white cane for King Denethor. It's the same Lego element that I used for General Maydeen. It's just a Lego Harry Potter wand in white that looks really great on the minifigure as a little cane piece. Additionally, I gave Denethor the sword that was actually included with the bootleg Lego Gondor Soldier minifigure, and I painted it up a little bit, just added some more details like the hilt and the gold guards. And then I also made him a cup with presumably a classic holiday beverage like eggnog or even Sprite cranberry, because after all, it is the thirstiest time of the year. But in all seriousness, I made a quick little chalice for the king to drink from, just sculpted a bit more of the rounded shape to a standard Lego goblet, and painted it in silver and added the necessary jewel details from what I saw in references. Excluding the Nightmare that was working with the fabric robes and the long hairpiece, King Denethor ended up being pretty simple. I would say his inclusion in this project wasn't that much of a priority, but I'm happy to have made both of the contrasting kings of men during the Third Age of Middle-earth. These last two custom minifigures are both Agents of Sauron, and up first is the Mouth of Sauron, and actually, I wasn't sure if he was going to make the cut in the end. I've always loved the way that LEGO portrayed the character as an official LEGO minifigure, and so I decided to whip out this figure pretty last minute, so you might notice that he isn't as complex as the other figures in this video. And I mean, part of that was just because I was getting pretty tired by this point, but also the character is only on screen for a few minutes during the extended edition, which in itself is fine, but that just meant that I didn't have as much incentive to make him to begin with, other than he's just another villainous figure, a servant of the Dark Lord himself, and LEGO already made a sweet crown for him all those years ago. And ironically, this crown isn't even the authentic LEGO element. As much as I love that piece, I was not about to purchase one from Bricklink to customize, so I went with a knockoff compatible replica, and it does the trick just fine. I have the entire thing painted in black, but the facial plate and horns are painted in gunmetal gray. What is authentic, however, is the head print showing the greasy, wide smile. You can see that I painted all the additional markings and scars all around the mouth, and generally, I repainted the gums in dark red. On the torso is a giant sheet of black fabric that drapes on the top of the torso and extends all the way down to the legs. It's very similar to Aragorn and Pippin's robes, in fact. There's some cutouts for the chest and the legs on both the front and back of the robes. I actually really like the subtle details underneath the piece of fabric. The necklace, or piece of jewelry around the neck, is dry sculpted, but the thread is the same material that I used on Mon Mothma, and this time I can tell you the name of the product. From what I can tell, it's called Waxed Brazilian Cord, and I think it looks great here, even though a small chain would have probably looked more accurate, admittedly. The belts are E-tape, and I outlined them, of course, to stick out better against the already black fabric. The part that hangs off near the center has a little gunmetal painted end too. As I turn the figure side to side, you can see that the belt doesn't wrap around the entire figure, but I do have the continuation as separate pieces on the back of the torso. For the legs, I did paint some brief boot details, including straps, but without removing the torso and the fabric robes, it can be a bit difficult to see. For the arms, I did make some gauntlets for him, made of E-tape of course, and actually I think it's harder to see these details. They're painted in metallic black, but mixed with the clear gloss coat I put on them, basically makes them virtually impossible to see, but in essence I just painted two random squiggly lines across each gauntlet. They've got no pattern, just completely free-handed, whatever line I could make at the time. And finally, the mouth of Sauron has a standard, boring, basic LEGO sword element, painted completely in gunmetal gray as an accessory. Seriously, there's some crazy diversity among swords in this project, and as a customizer, I'm all here for it. So that's everything I think there is to this figure. Honestly, not too exciting, but I can't deny that I've always been somewhat fascinated by this character's weird presence. So now that I've sat down and spent some time crafting this minifigure, I'm glad he ended up making it into the showcase after all. The last minifigure to end off the entire custom LEGO Lord of the Rings minifigure collection is the Lord of the Nazgul, the Witch King of Angmar, and by far a significantly better candidate to represent the agents of Sauron than the Mouth. This figure would not have been possible without the incredible crown and armor pieces courtesy of Reaven Blocks on Instagram, a seller whose speciality is making spectacular 3D printed accessories from a variety of franchises, and obviously my favorites from him are from the Lord of the Rings. He's made Easterling stuff, a complete armor set for each of the 9 members of the Nazgul, and even the Dark Lord Sauron himself, which I picked up a set for because of course I had to. Regardless if I'm ever going to make a custom or not, I figured I had to at least own one of the sets either way. I seriously recommend checking him out if this kind of service is interesting to you, and you can find a link to his Instagram page in the description below. With my custom figure, I wanted these 3D printed accessories to take the center stage and do all the talking. So naturally, I've eliminated almost all of the details to give the focus to these pieces. I did leave a few of my own additions, which I'll be sure to point out along the way though. In fact, the figure's other accessories are also from a third-party maker, so this figure is like a giant collaborative piece. We'll of course start with the star of the show, the crown, which I painted in a straight gunmetal gray, and I dry brushed the surfaces with a lighter silver to give it that metallic weathered look. And that's it. Nothing else was necessary to add. I mean, the beauty of this 3D piece from Reaven Blocks is that the cast is perfect right out of the package. I've also got a blank black Lego head underneath there, another perfect inclusion to the overall figure. Actually, the spikes here lining the top of the crown are really sharp, and I did manage to sting myself when I first unboxed this cast, so that was pretty cool. Really adds to the intimidating presence of the character, I would say. The chest armor is also a perfect 3D piece. It slides over the top of the torso, and the front, back, and shoulder armor is all jointly designed. Kind of like an official LEGO football uniform element. Like the crown, it's painted in gunmetal gray and dry brushed with silver. On top of everything, and adding a bit of bulk to the figure, are the fabric robes, all rather torn and haunted looking. There's 5 individual layers on the torso alone, and first at the very bottom is a general trench coat like many of my custom figures have. You can see that I cut and tethered the edges and even cut out some tears in the fabric to give it that ghostly appearance. Next are 2 more pieces that are glued to the fabric trench coat, and what I consider to be a miracle is that I was still able to slide the torso armor on top of those. These 2 draping pieces are glued to the chest armor itself and go above the shoulders and to the back plate, where herein lies the final piece of fabric, which just acts to hide everything messy. So that's a lot. I didn't paint any highlights or outlines because, like I said, I want these 3D pieces to do all the talking, especially that crown. But now that I think about it, outlining and painting wrinkles on all of this fabric would eat up a pretty big chunk of my already slim time, so I suppose I should be grateful I decided against more detail. The shoulder armor design looks great, I should add. They're both really detailed and intricate, which is so awesome. Of course, also painted in the gunmetal and all that. Underneath these 2 shoulders is actually 2 more custom fabric elements. These 2 pieces are small inclusions, but I glued them up underneath to just kind of stick out, and they even match pretty well with the rest of the fabric stuff. The gauntlets are very simple, in fact, the simplest ones in the entire project, these not even having an outline, just completely painted in gunmetal gray. Similarly, the leg armor is also extremely minimal. I dry sculpted each of those layers on the legs, which was pretty fun to do. I've always wanted to make some super minimalistic figures with only the bare essential details, so I got some practice down here. And the legs still have a little bit of articulation, even with all of these fabric robes and sculpted armor. So for the accessories, we could obviously start with the signature of the Witch King, the absurdly huge spiked mace. And this is one of the accessories included if you order the complete set from Reaven Blocks. But only the mace spike itself and the handle are included. I modified mine with another very small chain, and this one is a little bit different to the other strands that I've used before. This chain, while being the same size as the other ones, has a little bit of natural rust on it, and thus has changed to a slightly brown color, thereby making it realistically detailed. I'll say gluing these tiny chains to these pieces was a super tedious process, but I'm so glad with the end result here. Still, it's very fragile, so you'll never actually see this in action. Along with the death spike, the Witch King also has the sword and the dagger, which are both 3D printed from Miniman. Remember them? They're also the same maker responsible for the 3D printed Anduril and Glamdring. I painted the silver and gold details on the Witch King's sword as accurately as possible, while the dagger is just a base of gunmetal gray. Lots and lots of gunmetal gray. And now that I've gone through all of this menacing minifigure, that's it for all the custom LEGO minifigures for the entirety of the Lord of the Rings project. A very special thanks to you if you stuck around throughout this entire series. I'm so happy I've made it to the end of this video. It's 3 years in the making, but I'll save all that sentimental stuff in the outro, which we can all go ahead and transition into. And just like that, we've made it to the end of not only this showcase, but also the end of the entire LEGO Lord of the Rings custom minifigure series. And right now, I want to give a huge thanks to everyone who watched each of these showcase videos since December 2020. I'm so glad I was able to share this experience with all of you. I like to believe I put more of my creative passion in these LEGO Lord of the Rings figures than other figures that I've made in the past, so I sincerely hope that you've enjoyed and were entertained by my efforts. As a fan of the works of J.R.R. Tolkien and of the Peter Jackson film trilogy, these are incredibly special to me as a customizer. I'll be coming out with a full collection video here pretty soon, very similar to the overview of all of my custom LEGO Star Wars original trilogy minifigures that I did in the Return of the Jedi video. Just a comprehensive review of everything that I made, so you can look forward to that. But I mean, yeah, I think that's everything. Like I said in the intro, this series has been one of the most fun things I've ever done as a customizer, and by far one of the most rewarding collections I've ever put together. So one final time, thank you so much for watching each of these showcase videos over the years, and if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go partake in my annual holiday tradition and watch the extended editions. Merry Christmas everyone, happy holidays, and I'll see you later. Have a good one.